Mike, just to start and to reflect on some of the things that Doug put up there, I think Doug's almost last words were, it's not all gloom and doom. It's pretty gloomy and doomy. But can you give us a bit of insight in what's lying behind some of these pointers that Doug brought up? What is the... I don't know if you can give us some tangibles of what you've seen. Citybet always comes to mind as the sort of scale of damage being done and the way in which they operate.
Yeah. Well, the biggest issue for us, of course, in any form of regulation is verified. Things being able to be verified. If things go offshore and in unregulated markets such as Citibank, we have no visibility. We can't see what's going on. If you can't see what's going on, you don't know what's being potentially affected here in Australia in either the sports or whatever we're operating in. If you look at something like Citybet, of course, its ability to undercut the market effectively, is its marketing edge. It pays no taxes, it pays, all those sort of things that, there's no point of consumption tax, there's no anything else that it pays on the contingencies. So you can see that here in Australia, if you're a professional punter who can't get set because of, maximum benefit, maximum bet limits, etc., that you're going to look for other offshore arrangements. Or, more importantly, if you're a criminal, you're going to look for ways to anonymise your betting. And that's what places like Citybet used to enable. Now, we were pretty good here in Australia about trying to close them down from a number of perspectives because their operating model effectively was money laundering here in Australia. So, when we got involved with their agents here in Australia and quickly brought it to their attention of what they were doing was actually illegal on a number of fronts, we were able to close down a fair component of that. But that doesn't mean that there's not other pop-ups. At the end of the day, if you can go online and you can get through the VPN, you can put a bet on.
Yeah, and Tom, it's not just Australia, is it? I mean, it's dotted around the region. Can you give us a sense of the scale again, that the problem that Citybet is creating, and the amount of money that's being lost to the industry as well?
Yeah. On that particular organisation is very, very big when it comes to Hong Kong racing in particular. So the Hong Kong Jockey Club last month had one race meeting which turned over about $250 million. Citybet were not far behind that in terms of the scale of their turnover on Hong Kong racing. Year-on-year growth, it was up about 9% last year on Hong Kong racing itself. While Hong Kong racing is a big product of Citybet, as Mike alluded to, it's Australia, it's all the major racing jurisdictions across the world. And whilst Mike and law enforcement and other Australian government agencies really did take on the illegal market and certainly had success, it's rebounded because in 2019, Citybet turnover on Australian racing really did dip. It's since doubled, and whilst it's not as big as the Hong Kong turnover, it provides a real serious, credible integrity threat still to Australian horse racing.
So I think Mike said they're always ahead of the game, and Citybet probably fit into that category quite neatly. How do you mitigate this then? What can you do to pull that figure down even?
Yeah. So in terms of how to combat it, yes, I do think there is some sort of element about educating the gambler about the risks of betting illegally, not being paid by agents. That's quite a common thing. But really what it comes down to is price and product. Can the legal market compete on odds with Citybet and other illegal operators? And can it compete on product? Can it offer the same betting options and betting markets which Citybet are offering? And if the legal market cannot compete on either price or product, there are two key incentives to encourage people to bet illegally. And I think, as Andrew mentioned in his introduction to this, there are some racing jurisdictions with very high percentages takeout, who are not competing competitively on price. Again, that's something which is going to drive customers to the illegal market.
Mike?
Somewhere the market, somewhere the margins have to get closer. So the margin either in the domestic market here, like legitimate wagering operators, and the illegal offshore operators, somewhere it's got to get closer where someone's not prepared, the risk margin in between is not worth taking a plastic bag with $100,000 in it to a McDonald's car park to settle. That's at some stage you've got to get that down somewhere in the middle there, and you've got to put a premium on the ability to get settled at the end of the day and get paid.
Doug, I mean, it feels to me from the outside that's unrealistic. You've got too many things going against you to compete against an unlicensed organisation like that.
Yeah, possibly. Having said that, coming back to one of Tom's points about, one of Tom's and Mike's points, which was the value of information sharing. Mike raised it in his presentation. I brought it up again. I call it something different, stakeholder engagement. But that information sharing and that stakeholder engagement is really key. It's a key point, because what you can do is you can use those individuals or those stakeholders to, in essence, become force multipliers for you. All right? So you're getting them to help you, and ultimately for the betterment of society, tackle and disrupt this illegal betting problem. So I can't stress enough that information sharing, that stakeholder engagement strategy that was shown earlier on, because it can have success. You can look to mitigate. You can mitigate against the likes of CityBet. So there is success. So coming back to your earlier point, it's not all doom and gloom. Right.
Okay. So I mean, one of the things that is very evident from listening to you in the course of this morning is that the tentacles of damage that illegal betting is doing goes so far into society and affects all of us. And Catherine, I just wonder, when I think about integrity in sport, I do tend to think about the sort of world that you're an expert in, anti-doping and those sorts of issues. Where does sports betting fit, really, the issue of betting in terms of integrity, particularly for racing?
Yes, well, you're exactly right. Match fixing, race fixing, cheating in sport of all kinds is not new. We've seen evidence that it was in around the ancient Olympics. We've seen evidence that there were bribes being paid for people to throw a boxing match, a wrestling match, all of those sorts of things, tanking in order to get a better result the following season in the AFL, even for Melbourne people. This is not new. Cheating is not new. But betting has absolutely ramped it up. So as soon as you've got big pots of money, and we've been talking massive figures today in the earlier presentations, then you can see that the incentives for criminals who might have been interested in counterfeit medicines or illegal cigarettes or wildlife exporting or human trafficking or something or other else, suddenly there's a really easy way to get money laundered through sports betting and so on that is just another market. So that's what's really shifted for us, and I think there's a lot to learn from the horse racing industry, because you've been combating these threats for a lot of decades before sports betting was really becoming a thing in Olympic sports. So there's a lot to learn.
But can you get a sense as to how much damage it's creating in terms of perception on integrity? Because I think Mike said without integrity you can't have a punt, and yet we've heard numerous times people love having a punt. So it's the risk that this is having on racing.
It's enormously damaging, because what's the difference between sport and entertainment? If you go to the theatre or go and watch a movie or something like that, then you can watch it 10 times and the outcome's going to be exactly the same. But the point about sport and what's exciting about racing is that you don't know what's going to happen. And if the fix is already in and you already know what the outcome, who's going to win the gold medal in the 4x100 metre relay or whatever the event is that gets your blood flowing, then there's kind of no point What's the point of sport? So that competition and the unexpected nature of it is really what's important here, the uncertainty of sport. And as soon as you've got those fixes in, whether it's in an element of the sport, and that's kind of an argument, is that, well, it doesn't matter if I do a double fault in tennis or do a no ball in cricket, it doesn't impact on the outcome of the event. But it still does impact on the integrity and people's belief in that what they're seeing is real.
Sally, the fix is one thing, but unlicensed betting or illegal betting, whatever we call it, is still potentially something rather different, because it can still follow the way the race goes naturally. It might not want to affect the result. Is there a difference, though, between the effect it has on bettors, on people who want to have a punt, between what you might say is a very clear regulated market and this illegal market?
We do see a difference in research. Doing research looking at who uses an illegal betting site is somewhat of a delicate topic, because we have to ask people, do you use an illegal betting site? We do have ways to get around that. We know from our research that most Australians, and my research is based in Australia, but it is replicated in other jurisdictions, people prefer to bet with domestic operators. And in a very large proportion of the case, they have no idea they're not even betting with a domestic operator, because they simply don't actually care. When they're picking bet sites, where it's licensed is written in grey font at the bottom of a site somewhere. It's not something people are looking for in terms of a stamp of approval, the same way they look for, say, like the security symbol or some other indicator of authenticity. So most people simply aren't concerned with it as long as it appears to be legitimate, and that is contributed a lot to things like advertising. So if they've seen ads, if other people use it, these are things that are much more likely to influence the type of site someone bets on. But we do know that most people who bet have multiple accounts. So that increases the likelihood someone is going to have an offshore account potentially. Because if they're price sensitive or if they're looking for different offers, they'll have different accounts, and one of those or more might be an offshore account. Now, we do know that people who have gambling problems, and that's a pretty big issue. I'm giving a 2-hour workshop downstairs at an addiction medicine conference this afternoon. I'm going to give you guys the 2-minute version of what problem gambling means. Essentially, we know that unfortunately some people who gamble do so in a way that leads to harm for themselves and other people around them, including their family. It's often related to spending more time and money on gambling than is affordable, but the consequences range from relatively mild, having less affordable discretionary income, so you're not able to go on holidays, being preoccupied and thinking about it all the time, being a bit more stressed, feeling guilty or shame. But that ramps up to a significant level, to the point that people are not being productive at work or even being absent from work or studies. Their relationships are extremely damaged to the point of disrepair. They have extreme psychological distress and comorbid mental health and physical health issues, and suicide rates are much higher. So this is a significant issue. Problem gambling is recognised as a mental health disorder, and it's recognised as a serious public health issue internationally. Now, a lot of people, when we think about problem gambling, think about poker machines. Racing is a significant contributor to gambling problems. In our treatment-seeking samples, it's usually the second most common form of gambling that is associated with harms. In Australia, in the representative HILDA survey that was conducted based in the Australian Institute of Family Studies, amongst people who bet monthly on races, 6% were classified as having a gambling problem, and an additional 17% were classified as having moderate harms. Now, those numbers are almost identical to the people who gamble monthly on gaming machines. It's 5% of monthly gamblers, people who place racing bets are problem gamblers, compared to 6% of people who play poker machines. So this is an issue not only for illegal sites. The rates of problem gambling are higher on illegal sites just because people who gamble in a problematic way are just gambling everywhere a lot more intensely. But domestic and, all of racing, this is a significant issue we need to look at. And if we're talking about how to combat illegal sites, and one of the triggers is let's be more reputable, customers will want to come with us, then we need to have a more reputable product, which includes being mindful of to what extent does this product contribute contribute to gambling harms, and what are we doing to minimise that? Because it's not all about commercialisation, marketing, getting new people in. We need to think, how do we do that in a way that's safe and sustainable for those individuals?
A big part of your own integrity card as well, doing that. And there's the conundrum, because Tom, if you want to be more responsible, there is an argument that says you establish, as we're seeing in the UK, affordability levels, and you restrict the ability of people to spend more than they can afford. And then that backfires.
Yeah. I think this is an absolute massive issue with regards to the UK at the moment, where these reported affordability checks, where recreational gamblers are being asked to produce several months' worth of financial information, and then be questioned on that by betting operators, is pushing these people away, not just from those regulated operators, but pushing them almost directly to the illegal betting market. It is an open goal for illegal betting operators to take a focus on horse racing. If the recreational gamblers don't have to go through the same hoops, don't have to jump through the same hoops to actually get a bet on. And it really goes back to the points I mentioned earlier. Can you get a bet on? Can you get fair odds? Can you bet on the sport or the product that you want to bet on? And if you can't, there are all three major incentives to push customers to the illegal betting market. And racing and the illegal betting market, it's not as diverse in the number of operators who are offering fixed odds compared to other sports. But this is a real opportunity for the illegal market to jump in here if the customers who racing want to attract, the Saturday gamblers, cannot get a bet on without having to provide some pretty personal information.
Is there anything more that can be done, maybe this is one for Doug as well, and Mike, about data provision? I mean, unlicensed bettors want all the data they can get. They'll get it from wherever they want, and we don't necessarily know they've got it. Is there anything you feel you can do to alleviate that?
Certainly, maybe I'll go first, Mark, if that's all right. Certainly, discussions with those data companies is certainly useful, and that's something that the council has been doing quite recently, to get that sense. Where are they? What are they doing? How are they themselves doing due diligence on their providers? And that's an ongoing product. So having that communication channel with them, whether it's informal back channels or through formal methods, is key.
Well, data collection and data analytics is a pretty vexed question in this country, right? Who holds the data? You know, if we're talking about individuals, but also the data of betting operators, etc. So, which there are certain rules around, you know, how it can be dealt with. That's personal data here, but us trying to get data from offshore operators in relation to their betting transactions here in Australia, very hard unless we get some trusted insiders that end up rolling over. That's the hard part.
Tom?
Yeah, but just in terms of what sport does in terms of entering agreements with those data companies, I think it's essential they understand where their own data is going to end up, because they're entering into these commercial agreements, and some of these data companies are selling directly to illegal operators who are unlicensed. Not all of them are, but I think there's now an opportunity for sport and racing to have a say as to where their data is going to end up.
The sort of lack of transparency that exists, particularly online, is I was going to say is pretty apparent, is sort of ironically. But Catherine, things like white labelling is a big issue, isn't it? And it's not just in racing; it's across the piece. You have no idea really what you're sort of walking into.
It is, and what I was going to mention is what we're seeing in really low-level community sport is the number of data scouts now that are attending community-level sport, whether it's under 18 competitions or masters level, Division 5 football, basketball, volleyball around the country, where that data scouts are giving information back to usually illegal operators to create markets that don't otherwise exist. And that's very often done without the permission of the National Sporting Organisation and without the knowledge of them. And all that they can do really is control from a ticketing perspective or from an entry perspective in order to kick people out if they find them putting information back through a mobile service or other mechanism in order to create these markets, because that of course then creates a vulnerability that didn't otherwise exist. And Mike talked about it in his presentation about vulnerable sports. The biggest vulnerable sports that I work with are tennis, cricket and football, round ball football, soccer, the world game. And those three sports internationally are by far at highest risk. And then within that, the vulnerable people that are involved, it's really diverse. And the grooming that Mike referred to as well is what we're really frequently seeing now, that younger and younger people are being targeted and are being groomed by organised criminals in order to provide seemingly innocuous information, and they're being contacted through Instagram or WhatsApp or whatever initially. Great game today, really enjoyed watching you, blah, blah, blah. And then it starts to move into more malicious content.
Yeah, and once you're in, you're in. I think Jeff Kennett said yesterday his concern is about the lower level, if that's the right expression, but the struggling ones, the trainers or those trying to make a mark who are much more susceptible. So Mike, what can you do to help them? You talked about, for example, some of the coercive hearings that you can have and sort of pulling information out of with an immunity clause attached. Does that help in terms of breaking the link, of seeing where the link is between?
That does help, because it helps you derive the insights you need to be able to take some positive action. So even one of the things that I did last year is I spoke to the latest class of apprentices from Racing New South Wales. You know, these are all young men and women, well, kids, and spoke to them about the traps, the pitfalls around grooming. And it is grooming. It's just like how a pedophile grooms a young child, right? It's nice, it starts off well, you know, they introduce them to other friends, they introduce them to, you know, rugby league or football heroes that they know, and next thing you know, they're all excited about, you know, I'm a big deal now. I've come from my little country town, 16 years old, and now here I am. I'm going to a nightclub with a first-grade rugby league player because he happens to be a mate of a professional gambler, right? And then you're in. Then it's next thing you know is, gee, they're saying it's a soft 7 out the back. Is it really a soft 7 when you were training, or when you were breezing up the horse during the day? Or, you know, how did it really go with those blinkers on first time? You don't have to say much. It's just those little bits of information that give them an edge in a market, and that's all they're after. They're after that little edge. Information is golden. Like I said, they don't do, most of those professionals that have had the criminal associations, they don't do time and ratings and class and weight ratings. They just trade on information.
Yeah. Doug, the other side of this is, of course, just the loss of revenue, whether that's through taxes or through your own industries not getting what they should be getting in. One question I've had from the audience is about smaller jurisdictions and what on earth can they do? What resource do they have? Have you got any guidance for them?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, please go to the ARF website and read those publications. No, I'm joking. But this is precisely why the council was created. It's to provide those resources for everyone, and also to support those jurisdictions as they look to develop those perhaps in-house capabilities that we were discussing earlier on, or to go to their stakeholders hand in hand. The council can support in that regard as well, and help them with that narrative and develop together what is needed to really influence and persuade as necessary.
And the more you do that as a collective, inevitably, the more that ought to help.
Exactly. It's like a rising tide catches all boats.
Right, yeah. There's one area, Tom, which I haven't turned to you on yet, but that's about bet monitoring, which is, of course, something that you're engaged in. Can you just talk us through that a little bit and how effective that is and what it brings you?
Yeah, and just actually following on the question to Doug about the smaller jurisdictions, bet monitoring in the past used to be quite expensive. You bring in big teams and trying to have a lot of technological support behind it. Things have changed over the last 5-10 years. The actual barrier to entry to put in place bet monitoring models, which are processing vast quantities of data, those barriers have dropped massively in terms of cost, in terms of cloud computing, user-friendly programming languages. If you have as long as you have a real understanding of the betting market and a good understanding of statistics, any leading integrity unit or even the smaller horse racing jurisdictions can look to now put these models in place. So the barriers of entry have really come down on that. And it's absolutely vital to have these models in place, because the alternative is, and what sport has done a little bit different to racing, sport has gone down the route of outsourcing the integrity monitoring. But this means that they're actually waiting sometimes days after the event to receive a betting alert to say, oh, by the way, that match or that race 3 days ago, there was real suspicious betting on it. But having your own models in-house allows you to act in real time, to get in contact with the stipendiary stewards pre-race, for the jockeys and trainers, subjects of the suspicious betting to be spoken to pre-race, and to do what you can to make sure that event is going to be straight. There are huge advantages for actually doing more in-house, and it's just really understanding what the betting integrity threats are. One example is, I wonder how many racing jurisdictions here today actually know whether match betting is taking place on their racing. So you might have a race with 16 runners, but match betting is one horse to finish in front of another horse. So the horse could finish at 8th, and as long as it beats the horse which finishes, let's say, 12th, the first one is the winner there. And these markets have in the past been real subject to the obvious integrity threats. So actually understanding where the threat is, putting those statistical models in place, which is now far more possible and feasible for sports and racing to do, I think are absolutely essential to protect the sport from the everyday threat of betting corruption and betting breaches of the rules of racing.
That example, Sally, is a classic of, if there's someone out there with a problem with gambling, I'm going to have a go at that, I'm going to try this. What would your advice be to the industry in terms of dealing with, assisting, helping those problem gamblers? If I can, I don't know if that's the right expression.
It's not actually. So we tend to use, the language is quite important. We would describe someone experiencing gambling harm. When we refer to someone as a problem gambler, it implies that there's something characteristic about them that's problematic. So we're talking about individuals who are experiencing gambling harm, which also takes it away from people who are at that really severe level and moves it away and thinking about who are people developing harm. Because if we can intervene at those earlier stages and set people up to engage in lower risk gambling from their very entry into the activity, it's really important. So it should be something that industry are thinking about as we're talking about, expanding into new markets and commercial endeavours. Fine, but make sure that you're introducing new people to the activity, to the fact that it is a risky activity and they need to put in place ways to do it in a sustainable and safer way. Now, the type of product very much impacts how likely it is that people with gambling harms will bet on it. So more continuous forms of betting, so those quick, rapid, spot betting, in-play wagering, all of those things are more continuous and riskier, are more appealing to someone who is in a state sort of being out of control and emotionally driven and chasing their losses. So the greater variety and speed at which you can place a bet is going to increase the risky nature of the product. And it's so thinking about how we can set up an industry that's sustainable, where betting is fun, where it's an exciting activity, but it's not about winning, it's not about reliance, and it's not about providing products in, I suppose, so to the extent the commercialisation that it might be predatory. And that's not just the products, but also the advertising. There's more and more consumer feedback on advertising being very impactful. We know that advertising are triggers for people who are out of control with their betting or experiencing harms that encourage them to then go and have another session. So we need to think about how can we balance, commercial needs with the needs to be a sustainable and safe industry, particularly if we're trying to compete and show we're better than the, offshore markets. We have a sustainable product. This is, if you're going to bet, do it with us because we have protections and safeguards in place, not to the point where it's onerous or difficult or making it too tricky to place a bet, but to the point where people see it as reasonable. Just the same way as, people didn't like putting seatbelts on when they were introduced to cars. But car manufacturers didn't just say, okay, we won't have them then. We work on how do we educate and turn people around to understanding this is why you need a seatbelt. So it's about educating the consumers and bringing them along for the journey of this is why safeguards are in place and why you're going to be better off betting with a regulated operator in a regulated market.
Trouble is, with the seatbelt analogy, the chances are now also you'll be nicked if you don't wear a seatbelt. So that's but that's a government input into the problem. And I just wonder, as a last thought, really, Doug, maybe I could start with you. Get the role that government must play in interacting with you. Presumably, that is the everything, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It is by far the most important of those stakeholder relationships that need to be managed. And just as a sort of final thought on that one, it does need to be carefully managed. And I think echoing a point made on day one by Martin Pikula, I believe he said, and those perceptions and those understandings of those authorities, whether they be the regulators or the government, should be taken into account as well. Their priorities might not be the same to what us in racing believe. So having that 360 view of that landscape, that market, is certainly sort of key there.
Mike, maybe last thought, and it's a little bit of just a specific, but you talked about these high-value assets and likening it to a Rolex watch or whatever it might be. What sort of money are we talking about in that field, do you think, within racing? I mean, how many horses, how much money in terms of hiding it in a thoroughbred?
It's hard to say because a thoroughbred is a good store of value for a period of time. But if there's a liquid market to be able to move a thoroughbred, so an asset, then there's an opportunity for organised crime. So we've seen a couple, in my time that are buying and selling, buying here, selling offshore the thoroughbreds, and it just didn't seem quite right. I know a little bit about how it works, and if it doesn't feel right to me, it's probably not right. And so there are opportunities. And so the reason I highlighted that is because it's a back of house stuff. We don't see it. It's not about betting. It's not front. It's transactions that sit 2 or 3 steps behind the operation that is effectively a blind spot. Maybe a problem, may not be a problem, but it's something you have to keep an eye on. And my goodness, if we're selling NFTs, for example, on horses where the value of it is potentially contingent on how it performs on the racetrack, well, what a vulnerability that would possess, for inside information, etc.
And Catherine, maybe I could ask you, what is the sort of parting shot for what a sport can do to uphold and bolster its integrity when we're up against this sort of thing? And again, that question of catch me if you can, they're ahead of the game.
Yeah, what we've been promoting in the sports industry more broadly is whistleblowers mechanisms, and it's actually compulsory under the corporations law in Australia now to have whistleblower mechanisms. And in sport, we have been a bit slow to get them right in terms of the confidentiality and anonymous reporting, and to have the right people sitting behind those mechanisms to be able to take the calls and to deal with the information in a properly triaged manner. And so that's one thing that sport's really been working very hard on, so that we can get that information in and it goes to the right place. And that's been a huge change with having Sport Integrity Australia come on board as the umbrella body in Australia for all of the data that comes in and for those relationships between the different stakeholders, including government and law enforcement, both in Australia and internationally. So to have that as the pivotal point has been really crucial in Australia, and a number of other countries are now following suit. So I'd recommend that model.
Well, that's a good recommendation. I mean, it does feel like you are all pushing a very big rock up a very big hill, and that's not going to stop. But, as Andrew alluded to at the start, the process is there within the Asian Racing Federation to take this on board and to act upon it. So, can I thank you all for your expertise and your advice, ladies and gentlemen, our panel.